Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. And if you are watching us on our YouTube channel, you know you could catch us on whatever fine podcast platform you happen to get your podcast content from. If you are listening to us on one of those fine podcast platforms, go and check out the Federal Newswire's YouTube channel as well. You can see what's happening in the studio here. Leave us a like. Please subscribe, leave us a comment, and most importantly, let your friends and family members and family members' friends know how much you're enjoying the Federal Newswire's Lunch Hour. I'm very excited to bring our guest on today. As we've talked about before, I have this love of a law firm called Cravath, Swaine & Moore. And joining us today is Timothy Massad. He's a distinguished expert in financial regulation and fintech, currently serving as a research fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, and he's an adjunct professor of law at Georgetown University's Law School. With a career spanning public service and private practice, Mr. Massad is widely recognized for his leadership as chairman of the U.S. Commodities Futures Trading Commission from 2014 to 2017, where he oversaw the implementation of Dodd-Frank, advanced cybersecurity protections, and he laid the groundwork for virtual currencies as commodities. And we're going to get into depth about that question. Prior to this, he managed the Troubled Asset Relief Program, otherwise known as TARP, as Assistant Secretary for Financial Stability at the U.S. Treasury, helping the government recover more from the 2008 financial crises than it dispersed. Earlier in his career, he was a partner at Cravath, Swaine & Moore, as we mentioned just a moment ago, where he pioneered derivatives agreements and advised clients globally. As chairman of the U.S. CFTC, so we're going to get into what sort of his concerns and his issues with cyber cryptocurrencies and cyber currency issues. Tim, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Andrew, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It really is great to have you on board. And let me start here to sort of pull it back to the 30,000-foot level. I've written about this. The issue of cryptocurrencies and how they ought to be regulated and in what manner they ought to be regulated. You know, as clear as I can tell, there are three ways of looking at it, right? At least at the outset. Are cryptocurrencies a commodity, thus regulated by the CFTC? Are they a security, regulated by the SEC? Are they some kind of currency which would be subjected to regulation by the Treasury Department? Are they all of the above? Are they neither? Where do you come into all of this?
Well, I think it's important to make sure we know what cryptocurrencies or crypto assets or digital assets are we even talking about when we ask the question. And frankly, I think it's good to recognize that this technology really is more of a technology than an asset class. You can tokenize lots of different things, okay? But having said that, when you look at the landscape and what's been issued so far, it's a mix. You do have crypto assets that do represent interests in a business, if you will, and we can get into the exact test as to whether they're securities. And you do have some that I think, should be viewed as commodities. And then there's some that are really a payment mechanism, like a stable coin. In terms of my involvement in this, I was, as you noted, chair of the CFTC, and in 2014 was when we first took action. So well before a lot of the attention, was being paid to this sector. And what happened was that there were people in the derivatives markets. The CFTC regulates the derivatives markets, the futures market, the swaps market. There were people in those markets who wanted to do swaps involving Bitcoin. And under the law, the definition of a commodity includes lots of things you would think of as commodities: cotton, oil, so on and so forth. It obviously doesn't say anything about crypto tokens.
Right, sure.
Because it was written well before that. But it does say that basically anything else can be a commodity if it's used in a futures contract. I'm paraphrasing.
Sure.
Or a derivatives contract. So when people wanted to do swaps on Bitcoin, well, that made it a commodity. And that's why we took action when we did. And we started, um, we took some enforcement actions in the market, but we also allowed Bitcoin swaps.
Sure. Well, no, so talk about that. I mean, what kinds of actions did CFTC take? Because I think most folks sort of, when they think about this, they're hearing about what the SEC has done in the last few years on cryptocurrency. But talk a little bit more about, when you guys did, not that you may not want to get into it, and let me know if you don't, but what circumstances would trigger enforcement actions, and when would you engage in a lighter touch?
Sure. Well, we saw people as early as 2014 engaging in activities that we thought were fraudulent, trying to entice customers to buy crypto tokens in fraudulent ways, or offering derivatives on Bitcoin, such as Bitcoin futures or Bitcoin swaps, without having gone through the standard approval processes of the CFTC. And so, we took action against that and we were successful and upheld by the courts.
It's
And
it,
since that
oh,
time, the
go ahead.
CFTC has continued to take, some actions in this space.
It's interesting because, in part of the debate generally about cryptocurrencies, right? The whole point is that there's a very secretive nature over who owns them and where they come from, and in terms of that transaction, and I know you have concerns, and we'll get into those in a second. Maybe you want to answer that now about the one of the problems with cryptocurrencies being that, the transactions can be so secretive, and it allows for all kinds of, or the potential for illegality to occur. I would suspect that that would make it harder in terms of preventing fraud in things like swaps and derivative offerings. Talk about the very nature of cryptocurrencies and the problems therein.
Well, as you know, the blockchain is any blockchain is
Right.
in one sense transparent. It's a permanent record. You can go to it and see all transactions, but you're looking at addresses that are not like our email
Right.
addresses. They're a string of letters and numbers. And it's what we call pseudonymous. So you don't necessarily know who that address really belongs to. If you figure out who an address belongs to, in other words, if you figure out that blockchain address that's in a string of letters and numbers is actually your address, then we can see every single transaction you've ever made,
Right.
uh, at least through that address. That's an interesting property of blockchains. And so, on the one hand, they're transparent. On another hand, they conceal identity.
Yeah.
So, and that's a particular challenge for the financial sector because we're used to having a financial sector where we can identify people. Not
Right.
that all my transactions at my bank are open for you to see, but if the government wanted to know something, they could find out. Um, Now, in terms of illicit activity, in the case of fraud and manipulation, that when we were first addressing this in 2014, 2015, we could identify who was, promoting a certain platform. I mean, there was just enough evidence as to who that was, and that's who we went after. I think the concern today on illicit activity is in particular that you can transfer crypto assets on a blockchain in such a way that you cannot necessarily identify who the
Right.
actor is. And for example, we've seen stable coins in particular used to finance terrorism.
Right.
That came out with Hamas after October 7th. It's come out with Russia, with Russian smugglers using stablecoins to buy the purchase of weapons. And obviously, there's been a lot of illicit activity in the space. And that's a real challenge for law enforcement.
It's one of those things. It's funny. I was teaching at William and Mary for a couple of years, had done some work with their folks at the Global Research Institute, actually ran a State Department project on the use of blockchain in a host of U.S. aid contexts. But we had students that were doing research on this. And again, it comes down to this idea that it's a technology. These are
Mhm.
technological bases. They can have both good actors and bad actors. And
Right.
of course, with malactors, you can always get the downside to these things. And it's interesting because I had a conversation with somebody I know in the wake of, as we're recording this, Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, the premier of Syria, just fled to Moscow.
Mhm.
And I was asked about whether or not he had taken any assets with him. I said, well, theoretically, right? It's not like 1979 with the Shah of Iran flying out of Iran with, a plane so laden with gold that it almost didn't take off. If he has a thumb drive with
Right.
his, but this is part of what we're getting into here is the ease of this. Is there a regulatory solution here? How does this affect national security?
Yeah, well, it certainly does. And of course, that ability to easily transfer value is both a good thing and a bad
Right.
thing.
Yes.
It does provide, or does create a lot of the opportunities that this technology poses, but it also does create a challenge in terms of illicit activity. I would say on the national security front, there is a real concern here, and I've written about this. And I would say the concern is this. Today, essentially, banks are the gatekeepers, if you will, or the
Yeah.
checkpoints for a lot of financial activity. And American banks, US banks in particular, are the gateways because of the preeminence of the dollar and the importance of some financial plumbing that has been created over the years that have made American banks very important. Most international financial transactions, even those conducted in some other currency, often connect with US banks. If you're converting, Singapore dollars to UK pounds, you might actually pass through US dollars and an American bank would be involved. That has given us enormous leverage,
Yeah.
which we have used to impose sanctions. And you can argue about whether we've handled that leverage properly. Some people would say we've used it too much. But the point is that with crypto, you can potentially get around that financial plumbing and
Yeah.
you can move value without going through a bank, and therefore you can avoid US sanctions. And that's a real challenge. Now, the flip side again is, yeah, but we can see who's acting.
Right.
And we can do risk analysis of those wallets, even if we haven't identified exactly who they are, and maybe pinpoint bad actors or at least have a pretty good suspicion as to who a bad actor is. And if we know, we might even be able to ring fence that address, prevent other people from transacting with that address, or even seize the tokens that that address has. So there's, again, pluses and minuses. And, it's also important to point out the existing framework we have for preventing illicit activity and anti-money laundering, it's not perfect either.
Right. Of course.
So, we're kind of in a whole new world here.
Yeah, I mean, you've been doing the public policy side of it for a very long time, and now you're teaching, which is just wonderful. I mean, let's take it back for a second and let's talk about that balance. Over the years in your career, whether you were at Treasury dealing with the TARP issues or at the CFTC, how do you strike that balance? What are some of the balance between the risks that you're facing without making without destroying whole spheres of technology? How do you strike that balance?
Well, you really just have to look at the facts and circumstances in the individual case and
Yeah.
think about how to strike that. We're not ever going to have a risk-free system, and we
Right.
should be trying to achieve that. And I think that's important to remember. And so, we have to look at the benefits of the technology. In this particular case, the benefits of being able to move value potentially very quickly and efficiently. And then think about what are the means we have to prevent the illicit activity.
Yeah.
Are banks still play a role? Crypto exchanges play a role because people do, connect through those institutions. We often refer to those as the on-ramps and the off-ramps of crypto. So if you're converting crypto into dollars or converting dollars into crypto, you pass through one of those institutions.
Right.
We require those institutions to do checks on, knowing your customer and preventing money laundering. We can also monitor the blockchain and monitor who's transacting. And now we've developed some fairly sophisticated tools to try to pinpoint bad actors. And finally, I would say, looking ahead, one of the most important areas of research is whether we can incorporate digital identity systems so that you have some sort of digital credential that you can share even without revealing details about it. It's just kind of like, think of it like TSA pre,
Right.
been vetted. Someone has said, oh yes, Andrew is, been vetted by this agency. And then you can ping that credential when you're going to do a crypto transaction. And unless you were to provide that credential, the transaction doesn't go through. That's the kind of thing that a lot of people are, thinking about and working on. And that could be a very important development in this space.
Yeah, and certainly we're at, I think, I'm not going to say an inflection point, but we're certainly at a spot where that policy can change. We've just had an election.
Yeah.
Not to get partisan on this, but what I mean, obviously President Trump and incoming President Trump has called for the U.S. to lead the world on crypto.
Mhm.
We should be doing more to remain competitive. You've suggested that. I mean, what do you think needs to happen, moving
Right.
forward? I mean, now let me ask, as a subset of this, is this a job for Congress? Does Congress need to weigh in before the executive branch does, or can the executive branch weigh in before Congress takes action on this?
Well, I think we will see regulators taking action probably before Congress does, only because Congress has quite a bit on its plate
Right.
to deal with when it first comes back. I think ultimately we'll see some regulatory actions and potentially we will see some new legislation. And I would say, we will see a more welcoming position, if you will, toward the development of crypto. We'll see that in a couple of ways. One is we'll see a relaxation of the view that most crypto tokens and most crypto trading should comply with existing securities laws. I think we'll see some modification by the SEC of certain of its policies that make compliance easier. But we may also see legislation that creates a distinct approach, and that is treating more crypto tokens as digital commodities. And I think the question there is, okay, if you do that, you still need a strong regulatory
Sure.
framework. It may be different, but you still need a strong regulatory framework. I think we'll also see bank regulators taking actions to make it easier for banks to be involved in the crypto sector, whether as custodians or banking crypto firms or engaging in some way in stablecoin activities.
So there really needs to be some level of cooperation between CFTC, SEC, and Treasury on developing this policy. I mean, obviously, governed
Yeah,
by, somebody at the White House, the Office of Management and Budget, et cetera. I mean, that's the way it's got to work, isn't it?
I think coordination is always very, very helpful here. And, I was faced with this when we were implementing the Dodd-Frank requirements on
Right.
regulating over-the-counter swaps. And the CFTC had most of that responsibility, but the SEC had some. And, I worked with my counterpart at the time, Mary Jo White, who's chair of the SEC, on that. And I think here we do need coordination between the two agencies. I've written that the two agencies could actually do a lot on their own today without Congress taking any action. They could come up with some joint rules to regulate this space. And Jay Clayton, a former SEC chair under the
Right.
first Trump term, he and I have written about this very thing also. So we do need that kind of coordination. That would be very helpful.
And we certainly have in the new SEC, or the SEC nominee designate, I guess is what it is right now, certainly someone who is more outspoken about cryptocurrency than we have in a long time, isn't it?
Well, I think so. We'll see. I mean, Paul Atkins is, a very experienced, very knowledgeable person. He was an SEC commissioner before. He's been involved in the crypto space. We'll see, what direction he takes, but I would expect it to be more favorable to the development of crypto.
Right.
Having said that, I think a lot of the particular actions that Gary Gensler took in terms of some of his enforcement cases, I agreed with
Mm.
because there was fraud or manipulation, or there were people not complying with rules when I think it was pretty clear they should have been. But I didn't think what he was doing was enough in terms of getting us to a place where we had an overall framework for regulating this activity and this technology.
That's where I would certainly agree with you on that. Is just sort of there was a lot of vagueness that was out there in terms of what these rules meant. I mean, let's talk about that to go back to what we said at the very beginning of our conversation. The line between when it's a commodity and when something is a security. Elucidate on that a little bit, please.
Well, the traditional test as to when something is a security comes out of a very famous Supreme Court case from the 1940s called the Howey case or the
Okay.
Howey test. And the idea is that a security includes something called an investment contract. And you can have an investment contract where you have an investment of money in a common enterprise and there's an expectation of profit from the managerial efforts of others. Okay, so there's kind of four elements.
Okay.
And the SEC argued that many, many crypto tokens essentially represented that because they were launched by people who, essentially had a business enterprise who were looking to raise money for that, and the investors were looking to profit from that common enterprise. The counter to that is, well, these weren't really interests in a business per se. They had some utility in terms of facilitating a blockchain, or they were widely distributed. They didn't represent a profits interest, and that's where the argument came from that some were more like commodities.
Right.
I think what's important here, we've kind of been bogged down in this issue.
Right.
And it's unfortunate because I think what we need to do is create a reasonable framework for regulating the trading of these things and providing for some disclosure, regardless of what they are. That's why, I've taken the approach of, look, the SEC and the CFTC could do this today and not worry so much about the exact demarcation line, but create a framework for their trading.
Right.
Truthfully, a lot of what's been issued to date, may not be a security, but frankly, when you think about the long-term potential of the technology, it probably will be involved in tokenizing things that are securities, meaning
Right.
that, when you think about how can this really be used in a useful way beyond just people thinking, oh, well, I'm going to buy this because other people are going to buy this. And, that's what pushes up the price.
Right.
So, and that's when you start to talk about tokenizing treasury securities or tokenizing stocks and bonds or things like that. That's why it's important
Interesting.
as we kind of deal with the law and create a framework that we not undermine this really very, very good framework for securities laws that we've had for many, many decades. And that's one of the things that does worry me about, what we do next, because on the one hand, you might say a lot of these existing tokens aren't securities, but let's not undermine that overall framework by amending it in such a way that we're creating all sorts of loopholes.
Right. I mean, it's one of those things again where I'm sitting here noodling it through and trying to apply it to the business models that are out there, and this is why we need something else because it's all of it and none of it at the same time. It makes it all very, very fascinating. I mean, I guess here's my next question. You know, are we at the point where are we at the risk of a debilitating crypto event, either because of the lack of regulation in a marketplace or because someone makes a massive misstep in terms of regulation in a marketplace?
Well, I think that's always possible because there isn't a clear and adequate regulatory framework, in my mind. And look, when you step back and you say, all right, we're going to change some policies. We're going to do some things that are make it easier to develop crypto. That's all fine and good. I mean, I think a lot of that should happen. But I think the question is really whether, when you look at all the changes as a whole, are we going to encourage development of this technology in a way that leads to useful innovation and real use cases?
Yeah.
Or are we just going to encourage more speculative activity, more issuance of tokens that really don't have a purpose or an underlying value, and then trying to push up the price of those tokens? Because
Mm.
truthfully, that's a lot of what's happened today.
Right.
That's what I'm going to be looking for. Let's create new policies perhaps, or amend some existing regulations, but let's try to keep in mind we're trying to create a framework where there can be useful innovation. Now, that's not up to the government to decide what's
Right.
useful and what's not. I'd be the first to say that. But, there are different ways you can do it. You can say, for example, okay, this token isn't a security. It shouldn't have to comply with securities disclosure, which require disclosure about the business and the management and the financial statements, because maybe none of those things, are applicable. But that doesn't mean there shouldn't be no disclosure.
Right.
know? So again, we need to create a framework that ensures integrity in trading, that prevents fraud and manipulation, and that hopefully reduces some of the just pure speculative activity and encourages more useful development.
I just had a conversation with a scholar at the Abundance Institute. I don't remember sort of how we're going through and releasing this. So, folks, I'm referencing something that may not have been released yet, but we were talking about AI. And he said something really interesting. He said, when it comes to AI, we have to all remember that the AI that we're using today is the next to last worst version of AI that we're going to be using. That we don't know what it's going to be in, another year, 5 years, 10 years, et cetera. And we're having this discussion about cryptocurrency and stablecoin and blockchain and all of those things. We still really don't know what the technology is yet, do we, Tim?
Well, we don't know, I would say, exactly how it can be
Right.
useful, or we haven't seen enough real use cases. I mean, stable coins are probably the most important use case so far, right? A stable coin is a crypto token whose value is pegged
Yeah.
to an underlying asset, and the most important of those are the ones whose value is pegged to the US dollar.
Right.
Those have been used primarily to trade other crypto assets, but they could prove to be very important as a payment mechanism.
Sure.
So, that's the kind of use case that I'm looking for. And there could be others. As I said earlier, we could see tokenization of treasury securities, of money market funds, of other stocks and bonds. Now, that's not to suggest that, oh, let's tokenize everything, because it
Right.
won't make sense. But people are looking at whether you can move collateral around more easily and keep track of how collateral in the form of treasury securities, let's say,
Right.
is being used by using a blockchain. So, I think it's those kinds of applications that are important, and we'll see where we go and how those develop.
And of course, we're not the only ones doing this. I've spent a lot of time writing and talking about the China's policy towards Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining and how that impacted the market over time. We have to remember that there are other nations that are dealing with this. There are other nations that are, and there are non-state actors that are developing things that can be used and
Right.
abused. Talk about the role the U.S. plays in sort of leading the globe on the global framework on these things.
Sure. Well, having a good global framework is always, very useful, very important. But you can only get there through individual nations moving forward with their own laws.
Right.
We have a global economy, but laws are still made at a national level.
Right. Of course.
Nations have to decide what they're going to do and then try to coordinate. But we've done this before. We did it with swaps, with
Right.
over-the-counter swaps coming out of the Dodd-Frank era and the financial crisis. And, I believe we can do it with digital assets. But, the U.S. first needs to get its own policies in order a little bit more. and then work with other countries. And there are, international institutions that are already trying to do this. There's an association of securities commissioners, there's the Financial Stability Board, and they've both been active in trying to suggest standards for multiple countries to follow.
Tim, let's pull it back a little bit on some other things. Talk a little bit about you because I want to find out a little bit more about your career, the choices. I know these are the things that a lot of my viewers and listeners want to hear about. So you were at Cravath for many many years. You made partner, which is a not insignificant feat in and of itself. But then you made the jump into the public sector. I know you took a leave of absence at one point to deal with political issues, but you took the jump to go in and work on TARP and then to the CFTC. Talk about that choice. Talk about big law, and I don't mean that in a bad way at all because I have nothing but respect for the big law firms that are out there. But talk about sort of those choices. Did you know you were going to be working on public policy, or did you just sort of find yourself doing it? How did that happen?
Well, I'd always had an interest in the public sector, in public policy, and public interest activities. I actually started my career coming out of college working for Ralph Nader. That
That's
was back
right.
in the days when Ralph Nader was doing consumer protection, environmental protection, and so forth, and he wasn't running for office. Um, and then I went to law school because I wanted to learn about business and financial markets and finance, thinking, oh, maybe I'll only stay for 3 or 4 years or something and then go off and do something else. And, I left to work on the Mike Dukakis for president campaign, thinking that might take me to Washington. Well, that didn't quite work out. Uh, Went back to the firm. But I had a wonderful career at Cravath. I mean, I learned so much. I did a lot of interesting things, and I did them all over the world. I was
Yeah.
stationed in Hong Kong for 5 years. I was in London for a little while. And, I really learned a lot about how markets work and how business operates and work with a lot of companies, raising money to create jobs. And I always found that fascinating. Uh, the
Hold on for a
financial
second.
crisis happened and I raised my hand, basically.
But
So,
the thing about Cravath and the lessons that I learned from working with the very talented lawyers there is the attention to detail and the importance of not missing the small stuff and how important that small stuff can be in terms of the greater picture, whether it's public policy or litigation or what have you. I mean, am I right or wrong there? What are your thoughts?
well, that's certainly one part of it. But it's also, I think, Cravath, at least when I was there, I thought of as a very special place
Yeah.
because it had a style of training people that, ideally made you capable of dealing with any sort of transaction and really being able to analyze, something that was kind of very different from anything you'd seen before, but figure out how to approach it. And as I say, I work with all different kinds of
Yeah.
businesses, and I found that very interesting.
So
Yeah, go
So you
ahead.
make you go in, you work, you do the TARP management, you go and you work at CFTC, and then you make the jump to academia. At least if I'm understanding the timeline correctly, how was that transition?
Yeah, well, and I should say I'm only speaking for myself. I am
Yeah,
at the Kennedy School these days,
yeah, that's right.
but my views don't, and I run a little digital assets policy project there, but my views don't represent the schools. I had 8 terrific years in the government, the full 8 years of the Obama administration. I had two terrific jobs and worked with terrific people, and really enjoyed what I did and felt like I'd been able to make a contribution. And when I left, I decided, I didn't really want to go back to a law firm, that I wanted to continue to sort of be involved in an indirect way in public policy and also continue to give back. So, the opportunity to be at the Kennedy School was a great one. Um, and that's when I started writing more about crypto and about digital asset regulation. And I was doing some other things as well. I've continued to um, do a variety of other things, including working with a venture capital fund that invests in fintech companies. And
Wow.
that's been very interesting. And then I do my own sort of advisory work. So, as well as some nonprofit work.
Well, let
Um,
me let me talk about that. So it's funny because I explain this to all of my guests. Invariably, had I now do 3 podcasts. Nobody should do 3 podcasts, but I do. But I've been talking about doing a podcast for a while that I was going to call Outside Interests. And the whole idea was to talk to folks in politics and public policy about the stuff that they're doing that has nothing to do with politics and public policy. A colleague of mine who does telecom policy plays harmonica in a blues band in Maryland, and somebody else is a photographer, and I do competitive barbecue with my brothers. So, when you're not doing this work, what are you doing? What are some of your outside interests?
Cooking mostly.
Oh, that's right. Oh my God.
Passionate about that.
Talk about that. It's so funny. There's a financial services guy who's a donor to a lot of libertarian groups who used to spend 2 weeks every year working in the kitchen at the Inn at Little Washington. You've done that as well.
Yes.
Tell us about that, because I love to cook. That's like a huge passion.
It's just been a passionate hobby of mine for decades now. And I've had the opportunity to work in some high-end restaurants. When I lived in New York, I spent a lot of time at Bouley, David Bouley, the chef,
Yeah.
Who unfortunately passed away about a year ago. Had the top Zagat's rated restaurant, and he was kind enough to let me come in and, spend my vacations there. That was a lot of fun. Went to cooking school, both some in the US as well as in France for a while. And have just, always enjoyed it and spent a lot of time doing it.
I had a conversation with a buddy of mine about cooking the other day, and we both had the same fear. And you've worked now in high-end kitchens, so that didn't kill your love of cooking. I mean, that's the thing that always, it always amazes me is the sort of the pressure environment. Now, a lot of folks are watching The Bear. I knew this before The Bear. I would be afraid that it would kill my joy of cooking, working in a kitchen like that, but it didn't for you.
No, not at all. No, I always found it very inspiring, and it was hard sometimes. I would spend a week or two at a time, full shift. It was tiring, but boy, it was really fun and exhilarating. I learned a lot from people, just watching people, you learn a lot. But I also appreciated that it's a hard job.
Right.
And, David at various times tried to persuade me to drop the law and become a full-time chef.
Wow.
I don't know, David. I'm not sure.
That is a pleat in your toque, as it were. That's amazing. That is very cool. I mean, it's so funny because for me, it's like every once in a while, if I can pull a rabbit out of a hat in terms of a meal, just some little trick that adds to it, I get such satisfaction. I made last night. I'm sorry, folks are turning it off, but I love talking about it. It's so funny. I occasionally will fill in on a radio station in DC, WMAL. And one of the co-hosts, she and I love food. We love to cook. And it drives the producer up the wall when we want to start talking cooking on the air. She's like, nobody cares about that. And I think that's wrong. Last night I made a roasted cauliflower with a gochujang butter. It was like, I looked at it, I'm like, why haven't I done this before? It was so amazing. Is there anything you're particularly proud of, that you like pulling out?
I like to cook a lot of different things. I could never say, oh, this is my favorite dish. But no, it's just been a great hobby. And like I say, the opportunity to
amazing
hang out or work with chefs has been great. I have enormous respect for people in that industry. It's hard. I have these days, I'm actually helping an organization here in DC that trains young people to enter the culinary industry.
Amazing.
That's been quite interesting too.
Well, you and I offline, we'll talk about favorite restaurants in DC, places that we need to try. I would appreciate that. Well, Tim Massad, thank you so very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Andrew. It's been a pleasure.
Our guest has been Timothy Massad. He's a fellow at the Kennedy School of Government. He teaches at Georgetown University Law School as well. This has been yet another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. Please, if you are watching us on our YouTube channel, go and check us out on one of the many fine podcast platforms that are out there. If you are listening to us on one of those podcast platforms, go and check out what we're talking about in the studio. You can see what's happening here at home. Subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment, and spread the word of mouth about the show. Let everybody know how much you're enjoying it. I've been your host. I am your host, Andrew Langer. Have a great week, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream